Hello and welcome to the Barcast. I'm your host, Nick Barr, and we're carrying on with the 8. We're going to start with the social 8, whose keyword is complicidad, or complicity. So let's hear Naranjo's introduction. And this is a really great chapter. The social 8 is a kind of antisocial social type. If we want to use modern psychology categories, the 8 fits into the label of antisocial personality. More or less, a person who opposes social norms, or rather a rebellious person. But a social 8 is a type that can only be explained in contradictory terms. It's like a child who became violent in defending their mother against their father. Their violence stemmed from solidarity. The phrase to explode against injustice resonates strongly with them. The central issue of the social 8 was named by Ichazo as friendship. I, that's Naranjo, don't like to use words with universal meanings, or ones we could associate with great meanings to describe specific ego games, because often we end up using those words to justify those same games. That's such a huge point, and what I love about Naranjo's keywords and why we should be careful about keywords that sound appealing or potentially like reframable, like family. So complicity, you're unlikely to embrace that keyword, but I think it is helpful to think about complicity in the family, in this case, sort of teaming up with the mother against the father, being in cahoots against. So complicity, it relates to loyalty like that of a child who allies with the mother against the father and develops a strong detachment from the paternal bond, like becoming a difficult child at school. They reject school because the whole institution feels like paternal authority, and they come to experience intellectual detachment because intellect is also part of the paternal complex. Patriarchal culture is, after all, composed of intellect, authority, and control of impulses. And from what I understand of Naranjo, the sort of rejecting the patriarchy was sort of core to his overall project. So in the 8, and I do believe he was an 8, in the 8, you have this going back to contradiction, it's an anti-patriarchal type. We'll see that more as we go deeper on the 8. Looking at the social 8 with a Freudian mindset, the concept of complicity becomes clearer. We could talk about an Oedipus complex. We could say the child needs their mother's love and has no hope of finding love in the father. Therefore, they conclude, I'll join forces with my mother against my father. I'll protect mom and I'll earn mom's love. Entering Freudian psychodynamics, we could also add that this mechanism is not purely about loyalty, but is a matter of self-interest. For anyone with this character type, it's very difficult to go beyond the felt experience of simple loyalty. So this is not a type that's going to be in touch with their complicity, in touch with their need for love, in touch with their tenderness, in touch with their vulnerability. But they might be in touch with loyalty. Loyalty being something that they can access. If we were to ask Karl Marx about the nature of his solidarity with the exploited, I don't think he would ever be receptive to the Freudian approach, which would say he just teamed up with his mother against his exploitive father, or that his affinity with his mother was Oedipal and had something to do with his own need for love. It's difficult to make an 8 aware of their need for love. We're all driven by love. Every form of disturbed personality is a distortion of the way we act to seek love. One person tries by being too nice or too good in school, another by being too perfect in their morality, etc. In an 8, the central issue seems to be renouncing, abandoning love. They think it's better to pursue power, pleasure, or what they want, rather than wait for love or become sentimental. For an 8, people who seek love are sentimental. Thus, an 8 is a character that veers towards cynicism, harshness, and toughness. Moreover, 8s don't usually engage in activities related to self-awareness, since developing this kind of insight into their emotional life is a bit harder for them. They repress their tender side as if they had to bury their inner child to face life fully armed, ready for the struggle for existence, red in tooth and claw, as the Darwinists say. An 8 is someone armed to the teeth. So that's the introduction to the social 8, although I think a lot of themes refer to 8s in general. And yeah, this last point seems to be one that I hear, which is that sevens, we talk about sevens as sort of the least likely to show up at an Enneagram workshop, and eights would probably be the second least likely. And slightly different, right, where depth, sevens to some extent have an allergy to depth. Their form of gluttony is a tasting, a smorgasbord kind of surface level interest. Eights are all in for intensity, but when that intensity causes them to look inward, they're going to have, if they're in their eight, they're going to have an allergy to accessing the squishier, softer parts of themselves, their inner child. So this chapter is actually going to contain more information about that. So we'll get right into it. This is The Transformation in the Social Eight by Maria Elena Tinoco. Some hidden memories. Perhaps I was 4 or 6 months old. I'm looking at mom. She's so beautiful, full of light. There's something so interesting. We do this. I do this, I've noticed in my own inner work. When it's a happy memory, I was either 4 or 6 or 8. And when it's a darker memory, I was 7 or 9 or 11. Something about odd and even numbers is very meaningful. So perhaps I was 4 or 6 months old. I'm looking at mom. She's so beautiful, full of light. She seems like a celestial being. I feel so complete in her arms. The nectar of her breasts is so full of love that it shakes me. I look at her and feel ecstatic love for her. When she leaves me in my crib and I see her walking away, I almost feel like dying from the pain. I believe this is where that awful sensation of being dead comes from, an overwhelming feeling of emptiness and abandonment, extremely deep. I decide to hate her, but in reality I would give my life to be in her lap. I ask myself, is this where I first felt this existential void that leads me to try to fill it with lust, yet never succeeding? When I was between 2 and 3 years old, I wanted to go out, and near the door, mom had a brazier full of lit coals. She was about to cook something and I passed by. I could barely squeeze between her legs. I lost my balance and placed my open hand directly on the burning coals. I felt a huge pain that ran through my entire body, and they pulled me away. A sort of bubble appeared on my hand, and it hurt so much that I exploded with anger at both mom and dad, deciding that they were idiots because they didn't know how to take care of me. Revenge appeared as a companion in my life. It wasn't a premeditated or planned revenge, but rather a hidden one, lurking, an act suited for those who don't know how to fulfill their obligations. How messed up. So that's sort of the origin story for Tinoco, Maria Elena Tinoco, and really beautiful account. And this kind of is a great illustration of the origin story of an Enneagram personality. Like she's accessing a memory from her earliest months, and that memory, that divine memory, is innocence in a way. It's innocent lust. It's the way she describes her own mother with her big heavy breasts and just loving her, right? The way that we can think about the way that an infant just loves its mother. That the endurance of that positive memory forms kind of the germ, the nostalgia, the divine memory of the eight. This is the thing that they're trying to get back to, right? And so that's sort of the paradise for the eight, and it's characterized with lust but also with innocent lust, because the sort of the nectar that an infant desires. There's a purity there. Then later we have the experience of her losing her innocence, as happens to eights. Something happens where their childhood sort of abruptly ends, and they learn that they have to move into a protective stance. They can't be vulnerable, because when I'm vulnerable, there will be pain, or I will be betrayed or hurt. And so in her case, here she was right in her mother's company at 2 or 3 years old, and then scorches her hand. And what a sort of abrupt and violent end to that innocence that she was experiencing. So that's her origin story, and these are formative memories that kind of create the conditions for the personality to emerge. The lurking adolescent. An adolescent assassin? I don't know where she was hiding. She had hair styled like Yoko Ono, a shapeless body, felt enormous hatred toward women, and total contempt for men. She was 1.54 meters tall and weighed 38 kilos, just skin and bones. She was la flaca, the skinny one. She goes on to describe herself. Thin, not very attractive, felt more like a man, was very daring with jokes, very aggressive, sickening hatred for my stepfather. Most of my friends were boys, living in poverty. Cleaned a spa. I would leave home at 5 in the morning and return at 5 in the afternoon. I didn't know what I wanted, didn't know who I was. I felt lost amid a very difficult situation at home. I lived just to hand over my salary to my mom and to stay on the defensive with my stepfather. My existence seemed to have no meaning. I think this was where I developed a great disdain for life itself. At the same time, I recognized there was also a desire for suicide, but more out of revenge to make others feel guilty. The desire to kill or for someone to die was also constant. I felt immense oppression, and it hurt me greatly not to be able to quit my job since we needed to eat. The boss was the worst, and there was no way to tell her off. Also during this period, I felt caught in ambiguity. Religion gave my life some meaning, even so I always felt a constant hunger. I became a missionary, and in those years I lived entirely for that goal. But no matter how much I worked, and even though the mission was successful, there was still a great void that was never filled. It manifested itself in the disproportionate lust for projects. Now I seek to deepen the work I started 14 years ago. Today I see that I was a very dark and undervalued adolescent with a strong instinct to destroy everything while living as the quiet cleaning girl who spoke little and received too many humiliations from American employers who were never satisfied. And so we'll continue, but I'm glad that we're starting with a woman because the 8 is a very masculine type. And if you're a muscle-bound, stoic, tough guy podcaster, you might be an 8. But there are plenty of women 8s too, and Mother Teresa is sort of a famous 8 as typed by Richard Rohr. And the connection between 8 and 2 will come up throughout. But I think that's one of the strongest lines in the Enneagram, the connection between 8 and 2. And so here you have a woman who is a missionary and sort of threw all of her energy into that work. And so that's sort of this love for the underdog that it's very deep with the 8. But the work is fueled by a sort of, we talk about compensatory, revenge-seeking. She describes a constant hunger. There's a lust here, and it's in the case of Tinoco, it's mother lust. It's lust to be reconnected, to restore that initial memory. So that connection with the underdog is in some ways like a connection with the mother. In a particular family dynamic where the mother is oppressed or victimized. In this case, right, I don't think not all 8s. Okay, the beginning of the search. Meeting Claudio in my life seemed to make everything better. At the time, I saw the SAT program as a very liberating path for the indigenous people I worked with in the mission. I viewed it as similar to an educational synthesis for peace. As I walked the SAT path, I realized I was trapped in a shell bigger than a turtle's. Finding my truth consisted of recognizing lust as a sickness that automatically drove me to be intensely attached to the life of groups without recognizing my own deeper needs. It was being chained to the power that a group provides, but at what cost? Upon recognizing my Enneatype, what first emerged were the beatings, the pain, the helplessness in the face of such heartbreaking situations I had lived through. And from there, the decision that it was better to defend oneself and seek revenge than to become vulnerable. The process involved assuming a life where the constant was, I'll hit you where it hurts the most so that you'll be careful not to cross into my territory. Preemptive strike. A very small little girl also emerges with the crazy idea of saving her father and mother because they are so stupid. They are so unwise that they use violence for everything. So this little girl is going to show them a finer, wiser violence with fewer blows to the body and more blows to the other's egos. And she goes through the world like a dead fly, pretending to be good while undermining those who take advantage of the weak. It's something like, I can't hit or kill you, but I'll kill you with my internal contempt and manipulate your surroundings so that you realize what a piece of crap you are, and I'll always be there to remind you. This would be the little shit Elena from when I was 5 years old. In reality, this little girl doesn't care about adults. She doesn't fear them. Her strength lies in those around her, her group, whom she protects with her life and also manipulates against all those considered enemies. Little shit Elena. It's funny, in my own inner work, I had a phase where I kind of accessed my own little shit Nick. And I've talked about my own connection to 8 energy elsewhere. And yet I still think most of the... and I've been mistyped as an 8, but I do recognize myself more as a 4. And sexual 4, if you go back and watch that video, you'll see how much overlap there is between the presenting behaviors of the 4 and the 8, the sexual 4 and the 8. But there are a lot of clues that the 8 isn't quite right for my personality structure. Among them, this lack of the sort of classic Oedipal framework or this patriarchal oppression. But the viciousness is there, and I really am struck by this little girl that Elena is describing, who her violence, she renounces the violence of her father or her stepfather. I'm not sure where she was getting the beatings from. She renounces that violence, but chooses another violence, right? And so the 8, even in the renunciation of the violence done upon them or upon their moms or upon their little siblings, they can't help. They don't have another solution but violence. And so her violence is what she described as internal contempt, manipulation, blows to the ego rather than blows to the body. And in the process, the vulnerable Elena is wiped out. Little shit Elena is incapable of committing to a single person because she can't stand submission and doesn't want people clinging to her. Yeah, that disgust of having people who depend on me. So the saying goes, the ox licks itself well alone, directing everything from behind the scenes. That's what she likes. If it goes well, she thinks, wow, I'm awesome. If it goes wrong, these idiots can't do anything right. Envious, gossipy, rude, a liar, bossy, I have the intensity of a volcano. Recognize me, is my childish cry. Recognize me. I'm just a very small child, full of needs, full of hunger for tenderness. A hidden tenderness concealed under the shell of a turtle, a tenderness that I often hated to acknowledge. And that's where the 4 and the 8 really merge. They're both biting types, the sexual 4 and the 8 specifically. The sexual 4 is a biter, saying, I hate you, I'm biting you so that you'll see that I'm hurting, or that you'll love me, or that you'll give me some understanding, you'll recognize me. And the 8 is also a biter. By biting you, you'll have to see me. That wish for recognition is there, but at least in her case, it's see my tenderness, see my innocence, see my purity. The 4, the sexual 4 and the ages do have a lot in common in terms of this presenting material. I have hidden my primal need to recognize that I need to be loved to love myself. To recognize myself, my shame at being such a small child, my fear of rejection and abandonment. At its core, my lack of commitment to a partner has more to do with the fear of abandonment. My peculiar way of committing to the mission in the congregation I belong to was, in reality, a path of seeking where, through service to others, I found myself, my own reality as both an angel and a demon. My greatest suffering was the decision to leave the congregation, stand on my own 2 feet, without knowing what I needed or what I really wanted. Today, I begin to walk with greater awareness, realizing when I want to dominate someone or when I am manipulating, and I step back. This makes me feel freer, with fewer attachments to relationships, teamwork, material, or spiritual things. That's maybe a good way to continue to discern between sexual 4 energy and, let's just say, social 8 energy in this case. We'll look at the other 8s later. Is the sexual 4 is kind of like all bite in a way, or rather, they're like small dog bite. So they're not actually effective dominators or manipulators. They're not actually necessarily imposing. They don't actually have that intense energy that 8s do. So 8s really are that. They really are big dogs. It doesn't mean that they don't have a small dog inside, a tender underdog inside. But they also are protectors. They also are dominators. They also are really strong. They also really are lusty. Remember, her initial divine memory is a lusty memory. So their lust runs all the way through. What has changed in the process? She can give herself more time for reflection now. That's another way of discerning the 8. The 8 needs their needs met now. There's this demanding satisfaction, demanding compensatory action, this very short fuse that an 8 has, where they really need that delivery, which I can really relate to. And so I don't know whether that fits inside of the sexual 4 or within the 8, but I have trouble with delayed gratification. I am now committed to a partner. With 80% less anxiety, I remain involved with a civil association I founded, Edupas. But I stopped being the protective mother and I feel free. Mama bear energy. And now I live for myself according to my needs. Maybe that's a good way to move back into this. So a sexual 4's need for compensatory reassurance or something like that right away is, I think, more about how unbearable it is to be in that place of shame. So they're really looking for relief from shame. Whereas I think to some extent the 8 is looking for orgasm, like whether literal or figurative in terms of this lust. They're looking for the payoff. So I think the 4 has kind of more of an aversive movement. They're trying to get out of an uncomfortable situation and find some relief. The 8, I think, is actually genuinely trying to get revenge, exact revenge. And they do. It's just that it doesn't last. So in the Buddhist kind of cosmology, there's a difference between hungry ghosts and humans. And so hungry ghosts, whatever it is they crave, as soon as they eat it, it turns to dust. Nothing fills that hole. And in the human realm, the chocolate cake is really great for a few minutes, and then you have another slice and it's not that's good, and then you need a glass of whiskey to wash down the chocolate cake and so on. So there's slightly different qualities in terms of not getting satisfaction. It's temporary satisfaction versus like the 8 does get temporary satisfaction. I think the 4 is never satisfied. Something like that. Let's carry on. So reflection, she's getting space, she's finding choice. Self-knowledge, now I feel a new way of entering thought and can look at the ego as a prison, like that rhinoceros with small eyes and a horn ready to charge when it doesn't get what it wants. I also find myself choosing better in each situation, becoming aware that I can respond from the rhinoceros or from mercy, feeling from the heart, and thinking about what would be most beneficial. And of course, the easiest way to discern perhaps between 4 energy and 8 energy is just access to feelings. And so 4s have tremendous access to feelings, a huge tapestry of their own feelings, the feelings of others. They swim in feeling, which presents its own problems. And the 8, this is like, are you able to access your own vulnerability? Are you able to admit that you have some vulnerability? So it's sort of like it's sort of like the first door to feeling. But again, we all have that. Like the 8. There's a very familiar to me quality of 8 energy, of anywhere where I'm not upset, I'm not hurt, I'm mad. Excuse me. Right? Like, I mean, anytime we're getting tough and we're getting angry instead of sad, or we're getting aggressive instead of sharing our vulnerability, there's 8 energy there. So I think 8 energy abounds in a particular way, which is that like vulnerability isn't easy for the most natural reason, which is like vulnerability means possibility of getting wounded. And it's almost an animal-like response to be like, I'm going to bare my teeth and be ready to fight and kill rather than let you wound me. But that's 8's whole deal, as opposed to kind of an occasional move that they make. What is left behind and what is emerging now? What is left behind is blindness. From lust, there was always great anxiety, which is now behind me. I neither invite it nor avoid it. It arrives, and from it I recognize myself as needy. That anxiety would be moving into the thinking triad, 7, and ultimately 6 energy. The gang leader, or thug, as we'd say in Mexico. Let's just see what actually is the word there. Patotera, or pantichera. Patotera. I'll just put in patotera. which it's not a word I know, but pato is duck. Should we look up patotero? Troublemaker. But yeah, interesting pictures of ducks. Rowdy young thug. So that's left behind. That instinctive little girl is left behind. The disproportionate lust for projects is left behind. This is what the 4 and the 8 have in common, is they have a very young part that's basically been given the reins. She's no longer operating from that instinctive little girl. This disproportionate lust for projects is left behind. I now seek to deepen the work I started 10 years ago. Feel freer. Intensity also reemerges, but the difference is in how I use it. Now it's about sharing that strength from my personal needs. It has been very important to me to maintain a concrete commitment to SAT for the Mayan indigenous people, trying to strike a healthy balance between work and my personal life, more tolerant of frustration, recognize the rights of others. I understood that if my block came when I was a 2-year-old baby, it is completely absurd to remain in a place as if it were the ultimate in the universe. So her work is to occupy a real space. I try to encourage everyone to take their own space without being Mrs. Protector. At the same time, I feel free from expectations, happy with a more concrete, democratic, and achievable project. How I work on my character. So for her, she needs to do a lot of reflection. Every day I review my actions just to realize where I was responding from, what I said, how I interacted, what parts were ego-driven, and where those actions are leading me towards transformation or the trap of the ego. So that's really, now we're really in the doing triad. So she just acts. She just acts from instinct. And her work is to review her actions and understand where they were coming from, to create more space and ultimately more choice when it comes to how she's going to show up. And then you just contrast that to the 6 who we were talking about recently, where the 6 may be frozen in action and living in that kind of deliberation. I'll say this, but I'm coming from that, and they'll say that, and they're coming from that. So you can see how different the transformation work is for the types. If I need to keep walking, I need to watch myself. Otherwise, I won't even realize the actions that sabotage my growth process. So observation is really important. Friends, meditation. And here's an 8 thing. Some years ago, I got carried away, and instead of doing 1 hour of meditation as my teacher instructed, I would go up 5 hours straight. This burned out my circuits, and at one point I abandoned everything without understanding what was happening. Now I realize that it was the intensity trapped in harshness that cracked in the first moments, but I wasn't aware of it at the time. And so that's something that, an 8 may do if they're doing inner work or any kind of work, is burnout. Which can be necessary, but it may come from they may need the burnout to access the tenderness, but the burnout itself will come from okay, how do I intensely attack this thing? How do I intensely attack my self-work? The path to self-perfection. The pleasure I feel for intensity is very strong, and the path for me involves learning to live with limits. The companions in Etupas and daily life help me a lot with this. I want to become more human every day. It's about trusting more in the smallest part. Fritz Perls would call it the underdog. So the 8 is going to be clearly, especially the social 8, let's just say the social 8 is going to be a champion of the underdog. That will be accessible to them. They will have children or underserved communities or somebody in their life who you can see that protective side of them come out, that justice-seeking side. But they'll be completely, if they haven't done the work, they won't see how that's their own they have that same underdog inside of themselves, and they're completely neglecting that. They might not even have access to it, this vulnerable small part. So it's like a blindness thing. There's a blindness to the experience of the social 8, and I think 8s in general. It's a feeling blindness. It might even be obvious to other people around them, the way they might talk passionately about serving underdogs, and it's like kind of can tell you're thinking about you, the young you. In my experience, orgasmic regulation has become very important. After many years of living without understanding what was happening, the instinct was not asking for permission and wanting to do everything in its way. That's interesting. Mercy. I hope I didn't skip that part. She changed her name to Brisa, Mercy, for a while. And then the redemptive virtue of the 8 is innocence. Mercy and innocence feel really related. Let's see more what she has to say about mercy. Although it's very hard work, it would be helpful for social 8s to write down their actions each day and see where they lead them. Working with the body is very helpful. Meditation. How to help a social 8 through therapy. It's very hard for me to acknowledge that I need help. I think that's going to be a shared quality across 8s. It's difficult to find a therapist I can trust. I have a radar that immediately perceives others' flaws and shadows, and this is very tough for therapy. When I was living in blindness, I thought what bothered people was my frankness. It hurt when they told me they hadn't been honest with me because they feared me. But instead of letting it hurt, I would react with anger. So that's a great illustration of why is this a self-perpetuating passion, this loop? When I'm in my lust, when I'm in my revenge, I exact it on other people unconsciously, which causes them to fear me and withdraw, and therefore not be there for me, the part of me that feels tender and needs love. And then I take their withdrawal or fear as confirmation of their flaws, which demands even more anger from me. This is like a fire type energy, I think, for sure. The fire that burns really bright and others flee from, and then it doesn't have anywhere to spread, and so it just explodes and then is burnt out in kind of this featureless desert, extremely lonely. And then in that moment, I think an 8 can start to feel the tenderness. The therapists who have helped me are the ones who are closer to my person than those who are concerned with my neurosis. Group therapy helped. Yeah, so Brisa, I guess I skipped that part. It was about I can respond from the rhinoceroses or from Brisa. That's the new name that she assumed in her religious life, meaning mercy, which means feeling from the heart and thinking about what would be most beneficial. This is no longer automatic. I move from one side to the other at different moments. So that's the social 8. And I think it's just a really lovely chapter. I appreciated her. So, okay, right. So I think this is an example. It's always fun to look at the writing of the type, of the person's type. And what I think is characteristic of the 8 here, or a healed 8, is you can really feel, I mean, she's a great writer. You can feel the intensity of her longing, the intensity of her anger, the intensity of little shit Elena. So she's bringing to life this intensity. And there's a lot of tenderness there, but a strength in her vulnerability. And that's sort of the redemptive arc of the 8 in general, is when they learn to integrate their vulnerability and then show up as vulnerable while at the same time strong. There's kind of an unstoppability there. There's true strength there and innocence there. Yeah. So that's the social 8. We'll continue with the sexual 8 next time. See ya.